Welcome, friend, to this quiet hour where we peel back the layers of time together. Settle in, breathe. Maybe you're already under a blanket, or maybe you're simply letting the day slow down. Wherever you are, whatever city or country, whatever hour blows on your clock, I'm glad you pressed play. History has a way of knitting strangers into the same small moment, and that always feels a little miraculous. Tonight we traveled to Paris, but not the postcard Paris of croissants and sunlight. This is the restless Paris of the 1920s, a city still trembling from the Great War. Its cafés were lantern-lit refuges where art and addiction danced a quiet, dangerous waltz. What you're about to hear isn't a romantic legend. It was real, and it changed the art world forever. Imagine narrow streets slick with rain, the smell of tobacco and strong coffee, the faint taste of absinthe on the air. Artists gathered in these smoky rooms to sketch, to argue, to dream, and more often than anyone admitted, to disappear behind a haze of narcotics. Heroin moved as easily as wine. Opium could be ordered as casually as sugar. And within that dim light, masterpieces were painted while lives quietly unraveled. The war had ended only a few years earlier. Young men carried memories of trenches and midnight shellfire they could never forget. They returned home, but no longer fit the world they'd left. At the same time, wealthy Americans, restless under prohibition, flooded Paris with money and appetites that craved excess. Trauma met indulgence, and the cafés became laboratories for one of history's strangest cultural experiments. One of those wanderers was Jean-Baptiste Marot, a 24-year-old painter who arrived in 1923 with a battered suitcase and impossible dreams. He had survived Verdun, but not the nightmares. Sleepless nights drove him to Café de l'Amour, a notorious little room where the coffee was bitter and the real business began after midnight. There he met Madame Noire, a woman whose smile promised escape and whose connections ran deeper than anyone guessed. She served more than drinks, she served forgetting. The first time Jean-Baptiste touched the needle, the war's screams finally fell silent. Almost overnight, his canvases bloomed with color and fevered imagination. Critics whispered about a new genius, but every stroke of brilliance cost him a piece of himself, bought with German-manufactured heroin that flowed through the café like a secret river. He was far from alone. Americans fleeing strict families, British poets chasing inspiration, German thinkers avoiding politics, French artists drowning old memories. They all came for conversation and stayed for the quiet pull of the drug. Madame Noire barely had to sell. She simply created a place where surrender felt inevitable. There was a language to it. Special coffee meant opium. Sugar, extra sweet, signaled cocaine. And if you asked whether the painter's supplies had arrived, everyone knew you meant heroin. Ironically, the deeper the addiction, the more authentic your art was considered. Sobriety, people joked, was selling out. Across the river lived Margaret Worthington, a Boston heiress who fancied herself a patron of struggling artists. She rented a grand apartment and filled it with poetry readings and late-night salons. At first she only dabbled. Opium for curiosity, she said, research for understanding the creative mind. Soon, heroin became her private key to the art she adored. Her apartment turned into another hidden node in the network. Paintings were bought at wildly inflated prices, each transaction a polite disguise for the real exchange. For a while, it seemed intoxicating in every sense, but the glow faded. Jean-Baptiste's once revolutionary paintings grew repetitive, thin echoes of earlier visions. Margaret's health failed, her fortune drained. Artists painted to buy drugs, sold to patrons who needed drugs to feel the art. Money spun in endless circles, while the work itself grew hollow. Madame Noir, of course, prospered. Her café stayed open at impossible hours, attracting an international clientele whose wealth and titles made the police hesitate. To outsiders, it remained a bohemian sanctuary. To those who knew the codes, it was a quiet empire of the diction, hidden in plain sight. And so the most creative chapter of Parisian modern art carried within it the seeds of its own destruction. The City of Light glowed, but it glowed with a fever. Paintings from that era still hang in museums today, vivid, unforgettable, touched by brilliance and by tragedy. As you close your eyes, think of those smoke-filled rooms, the scratch of a charcoal pencil on paper, the soft clink of a glass, a whisper of music from a gramophone in the corner. A generation chasing beauty and losing itself, one slow breath at a time.
By the mid-1920s, Paris's left bank had nurtured more than art and ideas. It had birthed an underground economy no one had planned and few could control. What began as scattered pockets of experimental indulgence evolved into a heroin network hidden in plain sight. Café tables that once hosted debates on poetry and philosophy became the camouflage for a trade both magnificent and horrifying. Take La Chaîne Fumée, a three-story café near the Sorbonne. By day, its ground floor looked harmless, students arguing over cheap wine, tourists savoring an authentic Parisian evening, local intellectuals holding court. But when the casual customers drifted out, the real business climbed the narrow staircase behind a false bookshelf. Upstairs, the laboratory hummed under dim gaslight. American chemist-turned-dealer Robert Bobby Chen, Harvard degree in hand, had abandoned legitimate research for a more profitable chemistry. His makeshift lab produced heroin so pure it set the standard for a discerning clientele. Weak batches risked withdrawal during crucial creative frenzies. Overly strong ones threatened fatal overdoses before commissions were finished. Bobby treated his work like science, logging potency levels, customer reactions, and optimal dosing schedules with meticulous care. The third floor blurred art and addiction entirely. Paintings hung on walls, freckled with needle marks. Their colors seemed to shift as gaslights flickered. Artists brought their latest canvases for powder, each brushstroke weighed in milligrams. One of the most gifted was sculptor Élise Dubois of Lyon. The war had stolen her fiancé and her faith in order itself. Under heroin's spell, she worked 18-hour stretches, coaxing from clay shapes that seemed to rise from the collective unconscious, grief you could almost touch, the exhaustion of surviving when others had not. Collectors paid staggering sums, claiming to feel her pain radiating from the clay, never realizing they were literally purchasing another person's suffering. But each triumph demanded deeper dissociation. Each masterpiece required a larger dose. Without the drug, her hands shook. With too much, she drifted into blackouts. By 28, at what should have been the peak of her powers, she was locked in a cycle that made the next creation ever less likely. Meanwhile, the business grew sharper. Cash rarely changed hands. Art, sex, narcotics, and social connections moved through intricate barter chains that defied tracing. An heiress might buy a painting at an inflated price. The surplus funneled back into heroin shared among artist, dealer, and a web of intermediaries. Henry Lost, a former banker turned criminal impresario, perfected these arrangements. He never touched the drug himself. Addiction was bad business. But he tracked every customer's reliability, predicted trends in both art markets and street prices, and kept a quiet network of corrupt officials to tip him off before raids. Henry evaluated artists not for morality, but for productivity. A talent on the edge of collapse was a poor investment. By 1926, at least a dozen cafés mimicked the model. Café Noir catered to wealthy thrill-seekers. Café L'Or Blanc supplied established painters. Chez Phare specialized in opium's slower burn. Competition grew ruthless. When Café Désert Moderne undercut Henry with cheaper, purer heroin, a mysterious fire gutted their kitchen. When Le Tom Moore tried luring his best clients with exotic drug blends, a spate of sudden overdoses sent patrons fleeing. Violence remained cloaked as coincidence, but everyone understood the warning. The heroin cafés were too profitable to tolerate disruption. The scene drew a particular type of soul. Patrons weren't only chasing art or narcotics, they craved the danger itself. Overdose, arrest, financial ruin, or quiet retaliation lent an intoxicating edge no ordinary vice could match. Among them wandered American writer Jonathan Hayes, heir to a fortune yet addicted not merely to heroin, but to the peril and chaos that gave Paris's bohemian nights their dark, unforgettable allure.
Jonathan Hayes hadn't crossed the Atlantic to write the great American novel. He came to Paris to court danger, so that when he finally did write, the words would carry the sting of something truly lived. The heroin cafés gave him exactly the authentic peril he craved. At Café de la Lune, he quickly built a reputation as a man unafraid of anything. He shot unknown mixtures, experimented with reckless drug combinations, and inserted himself into volatile deals between artists and dealers that even veteran addicts avoided. When the fog of narcotics briefly lifted, Hayes wrote with surgical clarity. His fragments, raw, precise, and unsparing, captured the texture of addiction so perfectly that other expatriates treated his pages as required reading for anyone trying to understand the left bank's dark heartbeat. But his hunger for risk soon outpaced even his considerable wealth. Hayes agreed to a smuggling scheme that would move heroin from Germany hidden inside hollow picture frames. The payout promised a small fortune. The danger promised something more intoxicating. To succeed, he would have to pose as an art collector while carrying death sentences across international borders. European authorities, already sharpening their laws against narcotics, made no distinction between courier and kingpin. If caught, prison was certain, execution possible. Hayes's descent showed how far the heroin café world had traveled from mere experimentation. By the mid-1920s, it had become an ecosystem where art, drugs, and danger were interchangeable currencies. Participants weren't simply buying powders or selling canvases, they were purchasing experiences. The thrill of transgression, the intimacy of shared secrets, the sense of belonging to a society that existed entirely outside the rules of ordinary life.
The heroin itself was rarely the real magnet. What kept people tethered to those smoky Parisian cafés was the ceremony. The carefully repeated rituals of preparation and indulgence, the quiet nods of recognition across marble-topped tables, the sense of belonging that came with every whispered invitation to the next floor up. The powder was a ticket, yes, but the true addiction lived in the human connections it forged. Here were the outcasts of polite society, wealthy expatriates with restless hearts, artists who felt mainstream Paris had no language for their pain, finding a family in candlelight and shadow. Even those who managed to pry themselves free from the chemical hook rarely escaped the pull of the scene itself.
They might beat the substance, only to drift back night after night, lured by the laughter, the smoke-blurred arguments about art and politics, the intoxicating knowledge that in these rooms normal morality dissolved like sugar in absinthe. The cafés offered more than heroin. They offered an entire alternative reality, one where the clocks struck different hours and the rules of the outside world simply didn't matter. For a few heady years, it felt indestructible. But illusions crack. By 1927, the great left bank network had begun to wobble under its own weight. The finances were a labyrinth of favors and quiet debts that could never quite balance. The legal risks multiplied as overdoses spiked. The very bodies that sustained the culture, gaunt painters, trust fund poets, wide-eyed debutantes, were wearing out. The Paris police could no longer look away, especially once foreign embassies started asking why so many young Americans and Englishmen were being found lifeless in rented rooms. The first real fracture arrived from the most unassuming of sources, Madame Petit, a 70-year-old concierge with sharp eyes and the patience of someone who has spent decades watching other people's secrets. She kept the keys and the gossip at a modest residential hotel near the Pantheon, a place where café regulars sometimes took discreet rooms for late-night philosophical discussions. Madame Petit noticed the same faces drifting in at odd hours, their clothes powdered with flowery residue that wasn't flour, their pockets full of sketches and coins, and something harder to name. Bertrand listened. He asked questions others dismissed, and slowly, from the murmurs of an elderly concierge and the faint trail of ashes in forgotten stairwells, the grand masquerade of the heroin cafés began to unravel.